So, the idea of conversational fields is super useful because when you Cantor says that if a certain speech act is missing from a discussion or a conversation, it lowers the quality of the conversation, or it makes it less likely that the conversation will be productive. And of course, when in the other class you recorded and transcribed and coded a whole conversation, and then you can see which speech acts are missing. And this is a super useful exercise to do. But of course, if you are in the middle of a management meeting or you're out as a consultant, you don't really have time for that, right? You can't go like, pause, I'm just gonna transcribe and code all this thing, see you in an hour, right? You can't do that. So of course, if you're more sensitive to the kind of speech act, you can sort of keep count in your head and have an idea of if there's some speech acts missing. But there's an easier and faster way of doing it, and that is to be aware of the atmosphere or the quality of the conversation. So these are 4 fields, and the 4 fields they have a different feel to them. So the first field is the field of politeness. So you know this one, right? It's like when you are, the primary concern of people in the group is to have a nice atmosphere. And so you kind of know, like, there are certain things that's easy to talk about because we all agree. And then there are certain issues where you go, I don't think we're going to touch that one because then the conversation isn't nice anymore. So this is where you, politeness is where everybody's, definitely nobody's mentioning the elephant in the room, right? Now the atmosphere here feels pleasant, generally not particularly energized. It can feel a little bit drowsy, a little bit like pleasant but calm and maybe a little bit sleepy or a little bit dead. Yes. So if probably the first time when you start group work or something like that, you are very nice to each other, right? How many can relate to this? You're nice to each other. You don't do this and so on. But of course, what happens the moment? Oh yeah. So in politeness, what is missing? Which speech act would you say is missing? Yeah. Opposing, obviously. Yeah. So if you feel that everything is very nice and very pleasant, and then it's very good to do some opposing, to point to the elephant in the room, to speak the forbidden. So certain kind of voicing also is missing. And of course you can say the field of politeness can't hold up for that long. Not if there's something at stake. If there's something at stake, and especially if there's something at stake for you personally, at some point, somebody in the group is gonna go, okay, we need to address this issue, or somebody is gonna blow up, right? So if you keep it down for long enough, at some point, somebody has to speak out. And so usually it's the person who has the least resistance on opposing and voicing or speaking the forbidden. That person is gonna be the one. It's almost like the opposing energy is within the group, and it's trying to find a way out. And the person that has the least problems with opposing becomes the valve through which that energy can escape. And this is very interesting because you might experience yourself in certain groups, you're the one that always like says the points to the difficult things, where in other groups you're not. Can you relate to that? Like in some groups you're the one that pushes others, and in other groups you don't do it. Why? In the first group, your threshold is lower than everybody else's. In the second group, everybody else's might be lower than yours. So that means that energy of opposing finds its way out through other people, and you don't have to do it. It's the same with. This is a bit of a sidetrack, but I think it's really interesting. It's Aka Sagarian, who is a psychologist who worked with bridging individual psychology and group psychology, who has this wonderful concept where she talks about, like, for example, in a group, have you noticed sometimes in a group, you're the one taking leadership. You're the one going like, right, let's do this, you propose stuff. And I think some people, they have this feeling like, it's always me. Why is it always me? I would like to be in a group where I didn't have to do it, but I always seem to end up doing it. Who has that feeling? Yeah. Often what it means is your threshold is lower. So it's like everybody else can tolerate more lack of leadership than you can. Now, in those situations, what can be really fun for you to do is to go like, when you feel, okay, now I have to take control, you go like, I'm not doing it, and then you just wait. And then, the lack of control increases and increases and increases, and because it can't find its exit through you, then you'll discover who in the group has the next lowest tolerance level for lack of leadership. And then they are gonna jump in and take leadership. It's super fun to do. And you can do it with anything. If you're always the one that sorts out conflicts in the group, who says that you're always the one that takes care of conflicts, that sorts out interpersonal conflicts? Yeah. Some of the same people, I notice. But it's really interesting, again, to say, yeah, they're arguing. I'm not doing anything about it. And then you will notice as it intensifies and intensifies and intensifies, that energy is going to find its another valve, and somebody else is going to take it up. So yeah, that was just a little side note, but I think it is a useful framework to have in your mind. Okay, so when it happens that disagreements are revealed, it often happens in a little bit of an explosion. The more you are in a group where everybody insists on politeness, the more the energy builds up, and the more of an explosion it will be when the disagreements finally come out and are revealed. The wonderful thing about, yeah. Why is that? If you think about it just for your own point of view. If there's somebody that annoys you in a group, but you don't want to say anything, so you kind of tolerate it, and you tolerate it for the longer you tolerate it, the more likely you are to have it. The more likely it is to come out with a lot of energy, because you're like, now I've been tolerating this for half a year, right? It's like, ugh. Whereas if you tolerate it for half an hour and go like, that's annoying, you haven't had time to build up resentment and annoyance, and so it's less of an explosion. Another way of thinking about it is, I often think, you know how to make a bomb, right? What's the two? I don't know if you do, but in principle, what are the two components that you need to build a bomb? You need two things. You need something that expands, and you need a shell to keep it in, right? Because if you just have something that expands, you just have like firework or something like that. I don't know. But the harder the shell is, and the more of a sound you will make, right? Did nobody else make bombs when they were small? Was it just me? Okay, cool. There were these little at New Year's there were these little fireworks where you could the fountains, right? You light them and they go, and they were great because they had a lot of powder in them. And so if you took this powder and put it in like a piece of paper, and you rolled the paper up, and you had clay things in either side and a little hole here with a fuse, you made a bomb. That's fantastic. You lit the fuse and it will go boom. And the more powder you could put in and the more like hard the shell was, the better. I do not recommend it though. It's a really bad idea, but that's the kind of stuff I was doing when I was a kid. Okay, cool. So that's what you need to make a bomb. And this is why the more you repress anger, the harder the shell. And anger is the energy, the expansive energy, and the more it can build up. And then when it finally breaks the shell, it's gonna make more noise. Good. So the wonderful thing about breakdown is in the breakdown fields, you know what everybody thinks, right? There's no mystery. Everybody shows their colors. So, well, everybody who participates in the argument at least show their colors, right? So you know what everybody thinks, which is fantastic because then you have a good foundation for a debate, a discussion, for a conversation. The downside to the breakdown field is that it often comes with a lot of blaming and name calling and general unpleasantry. And so what often happens is after a while in the breakdown field, you'll hear people say, oh, let's just agree to disagree, or like something like this, and they kind of put a lid on it to get back to the pleasant state of field 1. Okay. So, of course, preferably that's not what we want to do. But if you look in group debates, you will see so many group debates that is basically just oscillating between field 1 and 2. Field 1 until people are too tired of something, then there's like a row, and then people say, oh, this is unpleasant, and you go back to field 1. Has anybody ever experienced that in their group work or, yeah? So what kind of speech acts are missing in field 2? Right, when you are in field 2, what kind of speech acts are missing? Yeah? Follow, yes. So somebody puts forward something you disagree with. It would be interesting for you to say, okay, cool. I bracket my side and I follow yours to understand it more. Yeah. So the listening, the understand. There's not a lot of listening going on there, right? There's a lot of move. There's not a lot of oppose, but not with much respect. So bad opposing. And not much listening. Anyone else? What's the kind? Yeah.
I think you also said no, bystanding.
Yeah, bystanding. Okay, yes, exactly, bystanding. You don't. Generally, there's not much reflexivity. You don't think about why do I have the opinion I do. Why do we have? Again, remember, it's like the question if for bystanding is not which side is right, but what are the underlying assumptions that produces this split, that's producing this debate, this disagreement. So bringing in that is that kind of listening, following, and suspending. That's what's needed to move to the field of inquiry. The main difference between the field of breakdown and the field of inquiry is that in the field of breakdown, people are identified with their positions. I believe this, and if you attack this, you're attacking me. And that's why you get this entrenchment kind of discussion going on. You're focused on winning. You fear that if you even listen to the other person, you will you lose something. You risk losing something personally, and therefore you don't even want to listen to them. In the field of inquiry, you get curious about, okay, so there's this position and there's that position. This is interesting, right? What is the? You will ask questions like, what is the validity of each position? What is the? What is it that each position is onto? That is valid, that is that has some value. That's an important piece of the puzzle. So I can't remember if I told this. Did I tell you about when I was out teaching dialogue practices for a group of people who were facilitating conversations in schools about alcohol? Yeah. I'll just quickly reiterate the story because it really explains this transition very well. So there you would, these people, they would say, well, we have a lot of science that shows that if kids, they start consuming alcohol later, it's going to solve a whole host of problems. So their point is to go out into schools, make sure that parents have talks and create clear rules with their children about alcohol and creates clear rules for the class, because if you have clear rules for your kid and then they come to a class and everybody else is doing something else, well, then you've just managed to, I don't know, ostracize your child for the group, or they're gonna succumb to peer pressure or whatever, something like this. So having that open conversation about alcohol consumption is super important. And then there are, of course, sometimes parents in these groups who say something like, well, I started drinking beer when I was 6 and it's never done me any harm, right? Or something like that. And okay, fine. So you have like, and then they will say something like, then they will, of course, start the debate, right? And they will say, we have all this data that shows it. And they go like, nah, I don't believe the data. Like the research is flawed or rigged or whatever, right? So they just deny it. You see a lot of that going on in society at the moment. And then one of the arguments that this side will make is like, well, look at this person in the class, right? His or her parents are the most strict parents, and that person is the one that drinks the most. So it doesn't work anyway to put boundaries for your kids. And so this is the argument, right? And then you go, okay, and you can debate endlessly. And you know you're right because you have the data, and the other one knows they're right because they have their personal experience and that other, case study, you can call it. So, and then you just clash against each other, and you can see that's breakdown. That is the field of breakdown. And it can be a very heated debate because there's a lot of values involved, and it's like basically you can hear in the background, it's like, are you a good or a bad parent? And so it's kind of personal, this thing. Now, one thing that's interesting is to then say, okay, let's take a step back, the suspending thing, and follow each side. So the people who say it's better to postpone the alcohol debut, there's a lot of research showing that it's better for your child's health. And so that's a piece of the puzzle, right? I think most parents would be concerned about their children's health. Okay, cool. I think that one is fairly easy to understand. Then you turn to the other one. How many feel that it's a little bit, do anybody have a clue about what is true and valuable and valid in that position? Anyone? It's not easy to see. Yeah.
Something about social initiation.
Social initiation. Yeah, say more.
Something about being part of the group and having experiences at the right time in your life that sort of suit the progression of your maturity.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. It's like, well, maybe it suits, maybe some kids are mature enough to handle it earlier than others. And others, can anybody see anything else? I think the case story is very telling, because the case stories, what they point to is like, here are some parents who put clear boundaries, and their kids, and it basically just make their kids not respect them, not take them into account. It kind of like severs the connection. So they're like, maybe like again with social initiation, it's like, well, if my kid want to do it, I'd rather drink with them, and then I preserve a connection and maybe a certain level of influence and control in my child's life. So this is an interesting thing, because it's like, well, that's very valid. Like, this person might not be primarily concerned with health, but might be primarily concerned with keeping a good connection and thereby influence in their child's life. And you go like, well, that's completely valid. So now the question doesn't become should you put clear boundaries or not? The question becomes how do you put clear boundaries, which takes into account this part, in a way that preserves the connection to your child, which takes into this count, which is a super interesting question and something that both sides can agree to explore. Does that make sense? How now we're moving to inquiry. When we, instead of just trying to shoot down other people and convince them of our point, we try to follow it, we try to bystand, we try to listen for what is valid, even if it's not, that side didn't really formulate it clearly. They don't say, I think it's really important that, we keep a clear connection or a good connection to the child. They just said, I started drinking when I was 6 and it never did me any harm. And by the way, everybody who has these clear boundaries, they drink anyway, right? That's what they say, but you have to listen to that and understand what is the underlying concern that you can relate to that's valid. And that can enable you to then formulate questions that are really good. Another question would be like, how do you know when is the right time, right? How do you know how do you look at a child and go like, yeah, now it's time to introduce you to alcohol, or, at least allow you to make choices about whether you want to drink or not. It's not a given that you have to be introduced. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it's always possible to, because if you have one person on one side not being able to be self-reflective, not being able to make these reflections, and you have other people in the group being able to make that, will you still move into inquiry, or will you stay in breakdown because one is always like taking everything personally?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if you have somebody in the group who is not self-reflective and has no intentions of being self-reflective and take everything personally, does that mean game over and you just can't move into inquiry? I think the thing to say is, and Isaacs is very clear in this point, you can't make dialogue happen. The best thing you can do is create the conditions under which it is more likely to happen. And so the short answer is no, you can't force a group into the field of inquiry. But if you listen to somebody who takes everything personally and you are able to articulate their viewpoint even more forcefully and more eloquently than they can themselves, their ears usually open. It may not, but it is possible. And I think in that, it's also interesting to see, this is true for all the moves between the fields, like from politeness to breakdown. You can easily imagine, and I've seen this many times, you've probably seen this yourself, somebody points to the elephant in the room and everybody else just go like, shh, right? And or they ignore the person, or they reject the person and go like, oh, you're always such a troublemaker, right? Why can't we just have a nice? And so you can't even move the group into breakdown. You because there's like a consensus in the group. This is something we don't talk about. Okay, so the field of inquiry, the feeling of the field is usually quite high energy, but like excitement. This is the energy of discovery and excitement, and it's the kind of feeling when you have eurekas, when you have discover stuff, right? It's vibrant. So it has the same level of energy as the breakdown field, but without the tension. Does that make sense? Good. So at some point, inquiry sounds good, right? Why shouldn't we just stay in inquiry? Well, I think, no, I want to make one more. I want to just round off the move from breakdown to inquiry. Now, I used the story of discussing alcohol with your children, but just to say, this is extremely relevant often in leadership positions. Because in leadership positions, you have to demote somebody at some point. You have to tell somebody that they're not going to get a raise. You have to move people to a different department where they don't want to go to. You have to say to somebody who's a manager and who part of their their identity is that they are a manager with responsibility for employees. But you might sometimes, I've seen this, like you merge two departments, and half of the employees report to one manager, and half of the employees report to one manager, and it's a mess. And you have to go into and say to one of these managers, you're not going to have employee responsibility anymore, right? Because we want everybody to report to the same person. And if it touches their self-identity, it's a really hard thing to do. And so how do you do those kind of things while preserving a good working relationship with them? You might remember back to the case I talked about with the oil company, where the central analysis unit, they had to tell these very enthusiastic entrepreneurial people who think that they had 9 good oil fields that they only had 1, right? But they had to do it in a way so that they needed to keep working with them. They needed them to keep listening to them, because if they just went rogue, it would be very costly. And yeah, so that kind of thing is really an important scenario in business that comes up very often in leadership positions. Okay, so getting a ton of insights and seeing new things and all of that kind of stuff is exhilarating, it's thrilling, it's super nice. But at some point you also need to take action, right? At some point your analysis and your insights should lead to actionable insights. And this is where you go from the primacy of parts to the primacy of whole. So a colleague of mine with whom I often teach this material, she has a wonderful question. And I don't remember, she worked with Bill Isaacs, and I don't remember if she got it from him or it's her own question, but I got it from her. And so at some point, the problem with the inquiry is the risk of paralysis by analysis, right? You just stay in analysis and you never get to actually take action. Now, at some point you can ask the question, okay, now we have all these insights. If this group were to speak with one voice, what would it say? Can you see? This is an invitation to again zoom out and consider the primacy of the whole. And in a sense, you are inviting in moves, right? This inquiry can become a swamp of bystands. It's like, but why do we assume this? But that assumption is based on this assumption. Do we even know that? Do we know anything? Why are we alive? What's the purpose of life, right? It's like, okay, we need to also get to a place where we can act. And so that's the flow, the energy gets a direction in that field. Good. Does this make sense that we have these 4 fields and you can kind of recognize the slight pleasant deadness of the politeness, the intense clashing, slightly aggressive energy of the breakdown, the exhilarating, bubbling curiosity of the inquiry, and the collective dynamism of the flow. So these are the 4 fields. And now, if you recognize the atmosphere of the conversation, you might know which field you're in, and if you know which field you're in, you know what kind of speech acts to bring in. Does that make sense? Even without the whole transcription and analysis and coding and whatnot. So this is why the model is fantastic. I'm just gonna say one last thing, and that is, there is also a move from flow down to politeness again. Now, that move is, you probably experienced this as well. You're sitting in a team, like a task team, and you get to, you work out your differences, you get to a shared understanding, and you get to an action plan based on the shared understanding, and you're ready to go. and then you go out to the rest of the organization and say, it's amazing, we solved it, here's what we do. But because the people in the organization haven't been on this journey with you, they're gonna go like, no, but I don't think that's a good idea because this, that, the other. And you go like, no, we already talked about that. And they go like, nah, I'm not convinced. And so how do you expand the circle to include more people? And fundamentally the answer is more dialogue, but with broader and broader groups of people. Good. So that was a lot of theory, but does it make sense? Cool. So I think maybe it is time for a little break, and then when we come back from the break, we are going to do some exercises. But I'm going to make an announcement in Canvas, and it's just going to have a link to a questionnaire. And sometimes during the break, I invite all of you to answer the questionnaire. The questionnaire is 10 controversial topics, and you just say on which side of the spectrum you are, right? Are you pro-choice? Are you pro-life? Are you, I don't know. Yeah, so it's formulated as provocative statements, and you just say, are you for or against? And then we try to see if we can find a topic where there's real disagreement in the group, because to practice dialogue, we have to disagree on something, right? Otherwise, we're just going to sit and be in the field of politeness for half an hour. It's going to be nice, but it won't afford you much opportunity to practice the kind of stuff that we've been talking about. So we have to find something where there's disagreement, and not just that kind of like, I kind of am probably mostly for, but like, yeah, where there's real disagreement. So fingers crossed that we're going to find something like that. Okay, cool. Let's take 10 minutes and come back. You get 4 extra minutes because you have to fill out the questionnaire. So we come back and start again 10 minutes past.